Solidarity is the only thing that's going to get us out of this.
It's important to be part of a union because you have to have a voice.
Welcome to Union Talk. I'm Randi Weingarten.
Welcome to another episode of Union Talk. I'm Randi Weingarten, and on this episode, we are taking on one of the many wars that Donald Trump is engaged in, the war on knowledge, the war on higher education, the war on America's universities and colleges, and a war where instead of actually supporting colleges and universities to do the work that they should be doing in America as the agents of innovation, as the engines of our economy, as the bastions of critical thought and engagement, as ways in which young people learn to thrive and be themselves and fly, as a place where everyone in the world would flock to say, this is how we learn to think, we learn to problem solve, we learn to innovate. Instead of doing that, what Donald Trump is doing is trying to have them bow to his demands on what they can teach and whom they can admit or who they can hire. The administration has launched investigations into dozens of colleges and universities. They've stripped billions in research grants from schools, and they are literally disappearing students. Disappearing students. Hear me say that word in the United States of America in 2025. Disappearing students who are here in the United States of America legally. And why? For exercising their First Amendment rights, something that we flock to United States universities and colleges because of the right to speak, the right to think, the right to learn. So, if you think that I am steamed about this, wait till you hear from the three colleagues I have on this Union Talk episode. I have a monthly New York Times column. I wrote about this week, about Trump's illegal and autocratic actions. They really are a tantamount to a war on knowledge. And as much as I am really proud of Harvard for saying no, and for not allowing itself to bend their knee to his ideology, think about all those other schools that don't have the resources to do the same thing. So Trump says his attack on higher education is in response to anti-Semitism on campuses. And let me be clear, we need to address anti-Semitism on campuses, and we need to ensure Jewish students, frankly, all students, are safe and welcome on campuses. But this is not about anti-Semitism. It's really about weaponizing anti-Semitism investigations to attack disfavored speech, to stoke culture wars, to try to create division, and to try to enable distrust. There's frankly, and I say this as a Jew, there's nothing about Trump's actions that will make Jewish students or any students safer. So instead of me talking on and on about this, I want to introduce you to the three amazing educators that are with me today. Todd Wolfson, who is the president of our affiliate, the American Association of University Professors, and professor of communications at Rutgers, and an amazing professor in his own right. Katie Rogers, a continuing lecturer at UC Davis and the president of UC AFT, and Marcel Aguiros, a professor in the Department of Astronomy at Columbia University. So I just want to thank all three of you, Marcel and Katie and Todd. Thank you for being with us in this critical and timely conversation. So I'm going to start with you, Todd. You and I have spoken about these issues practically every day for the last couple of months. But tell me, how are you thinking about what the Trump administration is doing, their assault on colleges and universities, and by extension, their assault on faculty and students. I talk about it as a war on knowledge and expression, but why don't you kind of frame how you've been looking at it and how AAUP has been looking at it?
Yeah. First off, thank you, Randy. Thanks for having me. And it's great to be on with Katie and Marcel, two professors and leaders I really look up to, along with, of course, looking up to you, Randy. And I really appreciated your frame at the outset. I think from my vantage, what I think is going on is straight out of an authoritarian playbook, right? That the Trump administration has looked closely at history and they want to accumulate as much power as possible. And historically, however we want to define the incoming regime, but however we want to define it, authoritarian, people have stronger words like fascist regime, however we want to define it, it's in their interest to undermine the sectors that could independently stand up to them. So first and foremost, I think that the goal here is to undermine the higher education sector as a sector that can independently stand up to Trump. I also think, and this goes to your point, there is a war on science and a war on knowledge going on. There is a part of the Trump base that's very, very suspicious of knowledge and science and expertise, and they want to crush it. And this also feeds the red meat to a part of his base. And to me, there's two other things that are going on here. One is you talked about the students being disappeared, and it's heartbreaking, those stories that we're hearing. And the struggles on our campus around Israel and Palestine are heartbreaking. And I think they're using that struggle in the Middle East, which is heartbreaking, to take a step towards silencing all dissent, all protest. And then the last thing I think they're doing is that they're trying to scoop up loose change for massive tax breaks for 1% of the population.
Thank you, Todd. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate your framing too. So, Marcel, you teach at Columbia, and Columbia was the first university targeted by President Trump, or targeted as soon as he became president, when the administration revoked $400 million in grants and contracts from the university. You've also been, a couple of years beforehand, a student at Columbia. So you've actually seen Columbia in many different incarnations and many different incarnations for you. So bring your listeners onto the campus right now so that people can have a sense of what it's like for you as teacher and what it's like for students on the campus, and frankly, what the reaction has been to the administration's obvious overreach. Bring us there. Bring us to campus.
Yes, I would love to. So first, let me say thank you very much for having me on for this conversation. And you're right that I was a student here and I was actually a student activist. So I have a fairly strong sense of how things have changed over the last 30 years in terms of the way that we look at student activism and student protests in particular. And I think, one thing that we should say is that to follow up on Todd's point, we've seen over the last 20 years, really since 9/11, the criminalization of protest and of dissent. And a lot of what happened at Columbia last year, and really in response to student encampments and student protests against the war in Gaza, I think illustrate this idea that we no longer see student protests as an essential piece of democracy, one of the ways in which we're reminded by the youth of positions that we accept, those of us who are older just kind of tolerate. And so this is all a long way of saying that in practice, it would be hard for me to bring you into Columbia's campus because we've been locked down for the better part of 2 years now, which is an unheard of situation in our history. And as you know, of course, Columbia has been the site of many student protests over decades now, and yet it has never seen really what we've seen over the last couple of years, which is a locked campus that's hard to get in and out of, that's now completely closed off to community members, where it's not self-evident that you can bring someone. My kids used to play around on campus. That's gone. It used to be a meeting place for people in the community. That's gone.
You have to
So
have
it
a
feels-
pass, right, to get onto campus now, right?
That's right. You have to get a QR code. It has to be authorized.
Wow.
It's a complicated process that's shut down all kinds of public outreach activities, including the bringing in high school students and elementary school. I mean, we used to have all the daycares used to use our green spaces, for example. That's all done. So it's a very bizarre feeling right now because we feel enclosed and trapped in this campus that, frankly, has been assaulted from the outside. So it's a weird dynamic because at the same time we're locking people out, but the people we're preventing from coming onto campus are not the ones who are really threatening us, right? The threats are really coming from DC. They're not from people on Broadway. So it's a very strange moment to be here and a dismaying one because it feels like a lot of the institutional response has been to things that are not really the major issues.
Thank you it's terrible for that, but thank you for the description. I'm going to come back to you in a couple of minutes. Let me just go to Katie. On the other side of the country, the UC system has been less in the news this year, but the impact is still being felt in so many different ways. So how is all of this, how is the weaponization, the cutting of research and the weaponization of anti-Semitism playing itself out on the campuses as a whole?
Well, thanks. I'll join everybody in saying thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. I want to echo what Marcel was just saying. I think that there's been a chilling effect across the UC system watching what's happened at Columbia and other universities. And listening to Marcel talking about the changes to the campus, the physicality of the campus itself really resonates with me as I think about the University of California's own long, rich history of activism that has been utterly attacked in the wake of what started a year ago or more with student protests being attacked and interrogated and investigated and really undermined in terms of what student activism and university activism can look like. My very first quarter teaching at UC Davis was in 2011 when the Occupy movement was happening. And some of you may know, maybe you do, maybe you don't, that there was a huge student protest at UC Davis that culminated in officers pepper spraying students to get them to leave the quad after they had been encamped for weeks. And I think about that encampment protest in 2011 and how when the students were ultimately attacked, the campus community, the university community, the surrounding community stood with the students, protected their right, and how that has seemed to shift so markedly now, where protest is seen as subversive, suspicious, anti-American even. And I think it's had, as I said, a chilling effect not only on student protests, but on activism of all kinds. My union represents contingent faculty. And I've said in many places before, when you're a contingent faculty member, you already have, I think, a sort of difficult relationship with academic freedom. For example, it can be very, very hard to exercise your rights, to feel safe enough to speak up and to protest. And there is no question that a sort of extended collateral damage of everything that's happening right now is that contingent faculty across the United States, I think, are even more wary about what precarity might look like for them. And this has a deep impact on our campuses, in our classrooms. And now I do want to just add, that sounds all pretty negative. I do think, though, that there is a very, very real rise in activism and solidarity happening among faculty and student and activists across our country around these attacks. And I think that in spite of fear, that I think is part of the objective, of course, of this administration, there really is a feeling that we are fighting for something important. I mean, higher ed as a public good in this country, I think has never been clearer for those of us in our classrooms and on our campuses. And I feel it on campus that people are really ready to do what they need to do to make sure that Trump doesn't win. Right?
It's kind of like this has just been Passover, and I've often said Pharaoh can't win the Passover Easter period of time. And in so many ways, the civil rights movement was just building on what you just said, Katie. The civil rights movement really got built on the Exodus theology and on how you spend hundreds of years in slavery and how you fight that in so many different ways. And in so many ways, this season of Easter and Passover, now with the Pope's passing, I think a lot about how we really value the forces of freedom, whichever manifestations they are. And colleges and universities are one of those places where young people learn how to be free. They learn how to be free in so many different ways. And regardless of what they do later on, it is part and parcel of what happens in a campus environment, how, engage in critical thinking, how you engage in nonviolent protest, what issues we take on and the sense of what it means, and how, in some ways, I'm going to ask all three of you now as adults, how we ensure that young people have that right to, regardless of whether one agrees or disagrees with the speech, how we make sure that speech is protected. And that's a really interesting and important piece here, which I think all three of you really talked about in terms of the values as teachers of young people. And I really, really appreciate that. I want to turn to the hardest issue, the hardest question that I get when talking about universities and colleges and the interface with anti-Semitism, because it feels to me that the administration has tried to create a trap, and that the moment you say that we are protecting speech, immediately somebody is going to say, oh, so then you are okay with anti-Semitism. And that is a trap. And all three of us, I'm sure, could agree. I see that that is a trap. But there is some nub and some truth to the fact that some of the protests, some of the people who protested made some Jewish kids feel unsafe. So how do we deal with that issue as unionists and as college professors? How do we deal with that issue so that people can't put us in a trap? I'm very proud of some in the Jewish community who say, not in my name, and I subscribe to that as well. But how do we deal with this?
I agree. This is the really hard question that faces our colleges and universities right now. First, I feel the need to say that I don't ever feel like Donald Trump, who during the Charlotte white nationalist marches said there was good people on both sides, is somebody who has my interests as a Jewish faculty member or my Jewish students' interests at heart and all. I don't trust him. I don't trust Elon Musk. And I don't trust the leadership in the White House to care about the interests of and safety of Jewish students or Jewish faculty or Jewish staff. I feel the need to say that. And so when I look at what they're doing, this does not deal with the charge of anti-Semitism, which I want to deal with. But when I look at what they're doing, I feel like they're weaponizing anti-Semitism for other ends. That doesn't mean there isn't anti-Semitism, right? And so we should distinguish those things for a minute. I think there's a very clear process in place for Title VI complaints around religious and ethnic persecution, and they aren't following those processes. So, and they haven't offered any evidence. So, but that's the Trump administration. They're cynically using this. My experience of the protests and of Rutgers, for instance, which had an encampment last year, is that there is anti-Semitism. There is Islamophobia. There is racism. And there's other forms of hate on campus in our protest spaces. Of course, we're part of a society where there's hatred and bigotry, and our campuses are not going to be free of those things. My experience at the Rutgers encampment, I can't speak to Columbia, hopefully Marcel can. My experience of the Rutgers encampment was that anti-Semitism wasn't structurally embedded in the protests. It wasn't a core feature of the protests. It wasn't the way the majority of the students, many of them my students, out there at the encampment making demands were thinking about Jewish people vis-a-vis demands they wanted to make on the Israeli state. Again, that doesn't mean there wasn't some anti-Semites in that. It just means I didn't find it to be a structural feature. And so I think we have the capacity to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have the capacity to say, we need freedom of speech. People need to be able to speak about their concerns on how Israel is operating in the Middle East right now. And we need a world where that's okay and people can protest. At the same time, we also have to demand that people feel safe, but we have to have some agreement about what safety means.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's the discussion we need to get to. What is an honest, thoughtful definition of safety on our campuses that doesn't infringe on the right of us of any of us to protest any number of things? Protest art like and strike for a better contract, or protest around the rising tuition costs, or protest around the war in Gaza. And so I think we can do that. And I think that responsible universities should step into that space with us as faculty. We're teachers with our students. We love our students, all of our students, and figure out how to do this together.
Thank you, Todd. I want to get to a couple of other really big issues. Marcel, we've seen the Trump administration take actions to deport Columbia students who are here legally, who have committed no crimes. And I suspect, Katie, that you're dealing with faculty and students getting their visas revoked as well. How is this impacting the climate on campus? What kind of fear, I assume this is spreading a lot of fear, but what kind of fear is being spread, and what is it that you think that all of us can do about this? Let's start with Marcel, and then I'll go to Katie.
It's an extremely hard question. I mean, I think we heard this weekend about Mahmoud Khalil's child being born while he's in detention in Louisiana and having to follow along on a phone call. It's outrageous and it's heartbreaking, and it's hard to know which reaction is stronger, right? The pain that you feel for that family, or the anger that you feel for the callousness of the act. And our students are outraged. I would say our graduate students in particular at this time have seen now several of their colleagues targeted in this way, and trying to reassure them is, I think, a bit of a fool's errand at this point, because there's no real reassurance that we can get. And so the chilling effect is, I think, massive. We have to have discussions about what is safe and what is unsafe. And we know that this is going to have repercussions on our ability to recruit talent, certainly now, but for the foreseeable future. I was having a conversation this morning with a postdoc I'm mentoring who's considering a faculty job offer in the US. And she said to me, "What about immigrating?" And I said, I don't know what to tell you about that. I just have no answer.
Right.
So I think solidarity is the only thing that's going to get us out of this, is to tie together these attacks in ways that make apparent to everyone that the impact of what seems like maybe a removed action, right? Something that impacts one graduate student at one institution or some Venezuelan in Maryland is an attack on all of us. And that if it can happen to them, it can happen to us. And I'm beginning to see, I think, more of an acknowledgement of this. But the pulling together these strings and building up this tapestry to understand just the scale of what's happening and how it does affect us all, I think has been hard because it's been so overwhelming.
Yep.
And my hope is that we can continue to have these conversations that bring together all of us who are being impacted in ways that we can fight back.
Which is part of the reason why we're even having this podcast in the first place, and unpacking the headlines of this so that people see and feel the human harm and what it means in terms of the potential of why young people go to college in the first place and why people teach in college in the first place. Let me go to Katie for that question too, because I'm sure on your campus, that's riling your campuses as well.
We've had at least 100 students across the UC system lose visas or their status. And we know of one lecturer as well so far. And I see this as a problem kind of on two levels. There's the institutional level, and then there's the personal level. Institutionally, it's chaos. The University of California, like other university systems, has responded to these revocations, saying they didn't have noticed themselves that this was going to happen. And I think it's really important at that institutional level to remember that sowing chaos is part of the plan for this administration, to create uncertainty about who's affected, what's going on, what the timeline is absolutely something that we have to remember is what they're trying to do, is to destabilize our structures internally. And it's difficult because it does sow distrust among faculty and students and our own administrations, who ideally we should be partnering with right now. And that's unfortunately not always happening. There have been moments where we've wondered if we can trust, for example, the Office of the President or a university administration. But then there's the personal level, which is, of course, the impact to the individuals and their families and their friends, and then our communities. And that is really, really complex. I think Marcel gave a great summary of all of the ways that this can destabilize individuals. And I think likewise in the University of California, we are seeing this effect of individual students and likely in turn faculty as well, wondering if this is going to be a safe place to build their career and to further their education. And the impacts and the sort of long-term implications of that, I really think we cannot understate or underestimate right now. And I do think, again, Marcel is right that solidarity is a big part of the answer, especially when we think of solidarity meaning information sharing, collaboration, and really strategic partnering with other workers, and other orgs within our university system, student groups, staff groups, et cetera. But trying to think also about like the legal frameworks that we can rely on as well, and to educate ourselves. So just this past weekend, I felt that I was learning a lot about like the SEVIS system, for example. And I think there were some stories out just in the last few days about...
You want to explain what that is? Since I don't think people
I don't know that I'm really the right one. but like the story that just came out a couple of days ago about, I can't even remember which university now, where the students had been told that you need to leave the country, but that's actually not true. So we just in our union had a meeting this past weekend and got a little bit of a sort of primer on the fact that you would think when somebody's visa is canceled that they're supposed to leave the country immediately. And apparently that's far from true in a lot of cases. And in fact, lawyers will tell you don't leave the country, et cetera. So that kind of knowledge that we can have to bolster what conversations look like and try to demystify and try to make sure that misinformation and certainly disinformation that's out there doesn't do further damage, I think, is where we're trying to put a lot of our focus now.
So I'm going to get to this question about the cuts in research as my last major question before I wrap up. But I'm hearing from all three of you different pieces of a strategy in terms of a fight back. And it's not just a fight back for the young people and for the educators on college campuses and university campuses, but also a fight back for, in some ways, the soul of America and the freedoms of America. And all three of you have talked about solutions as we've identified problems. The last major issue that I want to make sure that I ask your opinions of is that there's essentially this attack on innovation, an attack on research on new technologies, an attack on scientific findings, and a sense that if you don't kowtow to the president, then they are going to take over direct oversight of all of the programs in a university. Have any of you ever experienced this? I mean, it feels so 1984. It feels so completely alien to the American experience. But how do we describe to Americans why this is so antithetical to the American ideal of prosperity or liberty or justice or innovation? How do we describe it? Like, how would you talk about this in terms of not just hair on fire, but, oh my God, this is like so bad for even anything that Trump wants to try to do in terms of American competitiveness? Just take one of those things. Marcel, you first, since you're the scientist.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, this is obviously a question that we've been wondering about for some time, which is how do you make sense of this attack at all? Because from an American prosperity, from an American leadership, from a global health, from a global wealth perspective, kneecapping American research is about the dumbest thing you can do. And there are plenty of rational conservative voices out there that will tell you the same. It's hard to think of a more pristine international brand than Harvard, right? It is a shining light to people all over the world. And there's a very good reason for that, right? And that is that people know you come to the United States, our universities are fantastic. You can study anything you want. You can stay and make a life for yourself here. You can come back to your own country as an educated person and you can build a better life for you and for your family. And that picture it's an idealized picture. I realize that, but it's really being damaged significantly by what's happened over the last few months. And I think the key thing that I would convey, I think there are a couple of things to convey. I think one is that when you talk about large amounts of money, things get very abstract very quickly, and it's hard to really understand the impact that money has. And the main thing that, the $400 million that were taken away from Columbia, the threats for billions of dollars to Harvard, really what that does is it funds young people. That's what it does. It gives young people a chance to develop their skills, to build up their knowledge, to launch their careers. And so that's what you're taking away. And when you do that, you do multiple things. First of all, you damage those people's lives and careers, and that is callous and probably illegal, but that's a whole other thing. But then you also just damage the reputation of the institutions and of the country. And so our ability to attract talent, both internally and internationally, and to turn that talent into the leaders of tomorrow is already been damaged by this. And it's an impact that we're going to see play out over the next decade. We're going to see fewer patents. We're going to see fewer publications. We're going to see fewer groundbreaking discoveries. All of that is going to happen based on what has already been done. And so if you ramp this up, which is what the president's budget plans, right, by cutting our funding agencies by 50% here, 60% there, destroying NOAA in the same way that you have USAID, you're just going to augment that damage. And the reality is that whatever the next administration looks like, whether we win, whether the House goes blue in a year, 18 months, I'm trying to shorten the time frame as a way of staying optimistic, that damage is still going to be there. It's going to take an immense amount of work to reestablish the trust, to reestablish the systems, to repair the reputation. And so I think the major sense of urgency that I have for myself, for my colleagues, for all of us, is to convey that what happens at universities really does matter for everyone in this country. And by extension, because we are the leading university system in the world right now, everyone across the world.
Everything that Marcel said, yes, yes, yes. But I'd add too that I think the statistic is something like for every research dollar that goes into the university, $2 or $3 goes into the local economy around it. I think that people forget that this isn't just about the researchers, the faculty, the students, the so-called ivory tower elites. This is about the communities where universities and colleges are located. And I don't know of really any small or large institution that isn't embedded deeply into the community where it's located. So to lose money is going to be loss of jobs and loss of money for the people who live nearby. And that's the part of this that I really think people need to be talking about to their non-academic friends, to the non-academic people in their lives that might still want to relegate this to a really small problem. If they're not academics, if their kids aren't going to college or for whatever reason, this really can feel like an abstract problem over there for the elites. And I think nothing could be further from the truth, given the magnitude. Yeah.
Thank you, Katie.
I so appreciate Marcel and Katie's outline here. And I just want to add one other wrinkle to this, which is like the impacts it's had on our biomedical research infrastructure, the impacts it has on our economy are devastating. Just today in the Rolling Stone, there was a study that came out about the $15 billion that's been cut in USAID money. And they are approximating 15 million deaths in this research, that it will create 15 million deaths. It's in the Rolling Stone today. It's a new research paper that's coming out imminently. So let's take that home. Let's take that home for a minute. We're talking about $20 billion of money being cut out of the NIH funding for basic fundamental research on all of the things all of us face, unfortunately, as people in impermanent human bodies. All of us face, whether it's heart disease or diabetes or cancer, or our mothers and fathers face it, or our children face it, or our best friends face it. And what they have basically done is made sure that the therapies that would be coming out tomorrow and save our lives tomorrow don't come out tomorrow and maybe come out a decade from now. So the impact this is going to have on the health of every single American is bewildering. And so when you really step back and look at this, it shows that the Trump administration does not care about us. They do not care about the everyday lives of U.S. citizens, regardless of whether you're white and Christian or Black or Jewish or Muslim. They don't care about any of us because they're cutting the fundamental research that would save, that we all depend on. And I think that's another part of this story, alongside the massive economic impacts and the complete destruction of our biomedical research infrastructure.
So thank you for all of this, because I think this actually gets us to kind of like the last question I'm going to ask all three of you, and why I did this column in the New York Times this week. Because, look, the headlines are Trump versus Harvard, as opposed to all of the whys. And I'm sure that people get Harvard doesn't want to be controlled by Trump. And that is really important for lots of different reasons. But what all three of you just said about the purpose of university, the purpose of college, but also the economic impact that it has on the communities in which colleges are situated. So the long-term purpose, the short-term purpose, what colleges have done in terms of creating the allure of America. And so the last question for all of us is, look, I know all three of us, we're all leaders in our respective locals or national unions. None of us are taking this sitting down, and none of us are not going to be out there fighting this. So let me not talk about the lawsuits like Marcel, AAUP, Columbia, AAUP nationally, AFT. We've all taken the Columbia lawsuit, and that's important. But this is the question. This is my last question. What can everyday people who are listening to us, who are hearing our voices, who this bugs them? We've just spent 45 minutes educating people. What can they do? How can people fight back? How can people engage in this fight for both a fairer America, more affordable college, more access for college, but also how do we fight back against these cuts? How do we fight back against this curtailment of our fundamental civil rights? How do we fight back against hate? How do we do all of these? What can a listener who's listening or watching this podcast, what can they do?
I think that this is the question, and I think this is the conversation that I know that I'm hearing increasingly, like, what are we headed toward? And how do we bring in more people? So I think simply people need to stand up and get out. The rallies that have been happening around the country are growing each week. I think that's a really important thing. I think that when it comes to higher ed specifically, I would encourage people, if they are alum of universities and colleges, if they've got kids there, I think they need to write to those administrations and say that they want their college, their alma mater, to stand up, to join Harvard, or to be on the side that is refusing to capitulate or give in. I think that matters. But at the end of the day, I do think that the question a lot of us are asking is, are we headed for something like a general strike? And I think that that conversation I'm hearing outside of what I would call labor circles. I'm talking to neighbors. I'm talking to people I know outside of the university. And this is a real conversation happening. And I think it's probably one of the most intriguing parts of what's going on right now is for people who don't see themselves as labor activists, recognizing that something like a walkout in where whatever their day job is or whatever their sector of our economy is might have an impact. And I think that that's going to be a really intriguing part of where we go next.
I have said to people that we have to see enough of an escalation. When people ask me this question, I have said, I have to see enough of an escalation on the streets because one is not going to fetish striking and nationwide strike. And when I'm starting to see 1 million people in one place or 10 million people in one place, that's an engagement that I think look, just like everybody who's fought autocracy, people have to actually be considering this. But I'm really intrigued, Katie, that neighbors have started to talk about that because they understand the importance that labor has when we withhold our labor. That is one of the most important ways. Look at what just happened in terms of South Korea when everybody went on the street. And in some ways, there was a nationwide strike because everybody was on the street and everybody said, we ain't doing martial law. And it was really I found it quite inspiring. Marcel and Todd, what do you think? What do we tell people?
I agree with everything that has just been said. I would add that one of my personal disappointments of late has been that I don't feel like the political voices, we've all noticed that Congress has gone AWOL over the last couple of months. And personally, over the last week or so, I've been trying to reach out to representatives and my senators to talk about this situation and tie some of these pieces together, because I do think we need leaders to be challenging the narrative right now and to be speaking up and not to be taking attitudes of, I don't know if there's some anticipatory compliance that's happened, but there's also just a lot of silence. And I think we need that to change. And I also believe that there's a each one teach one sort of moment happening here where for those of us who are in higher ed and who have felt rightly or wrongly somewhat removed from the day-to-day lives of our compatriots, this is an opportunity to remind them that we exist and that we appreciate them and that we need them in the same way that they need us. So I think there was earlier, the silver lining that was mentioned was the development of senses of solidarity in places where we haven't seen much of that. And I think amongst the faculty in a place like Columbia, I think that's something that we haven't had historically. And we haven't necessarily been able to partner with unions and to see our struggles as part of that same struggle. So I'm hoping that we can do that. We can change the way we perceive our own roles and the way that we interact with our fellow workers to push back together. But it's going to take a lot of effort. And so It's not going to be easy.
Yeah. Okay, Todd, you got the last word.
Yeah, I'll just build off what all three of you said because I feel really aligned with it. I think at one level, to our elected leaders, we need to be in their offices. We need to be explaining really clearly to them what we expect of them, whether they're red state Republicans or they're purple state swing districts or they're blue state Democrats that aren't speaking loud enough. We need to be in their offices. We need to tell them the compact we expect. No cuts to Social Security, no cuts to Medicaid, no elimination of the DOE and full funding of K-12, full funding of NIH, no layoffs of our federal workers, no breach of collective bargaining rights or the right to protest, right? We need to offer a people's compact right now, and that people's compact needs to align the multiple sectors that need to stand up and fight back. And so that's what I think needs to happen. And then I really agree with Randy in that we need militant action. But, my friend, Reverend Dr. Leslie Harris, just has a book that came out, and it's titled, You Only Get What You're Organized to Take, right? And so we can't just call a general strike. We have to build a general strike. We have to structure test, and we need to know that we can pull something off that is at a mass scale, that we can win. And also we're protected from some of the responses we might see from the Trump administration, right? And so that's on us. That's on AFT and AAUP. It's on the sectors to do that work. So I think it's time. We need a hot labor summer. We need to get our folks trained in direct action. We need to get our folks trained in one-on-one organizing, mass organizing, comms, and we need to have a plan, and we need to pull that plan together. And it can't just be higher ed. It needs to be all of us: higher ed, pre-K-12, healthcare workers, federal workers, ports, hopefully, our building trades. We all need to align and do this together.
Yeah.
But the one thing I'll say is, I think they've overplayed their hand. I see a tide turning, and I see our sector, higher ed, which has never been a very good organized sector, except for the work of AFT. It's never been a super organized sector. I see that changing right now. I see a stronger, more organized, more focused sector. And so that gives me hope.
So I want to just say to all of you, thank you so very, very, very much. And I think you raised the issues. There are so much that's going on that's kind of changing our way of life. At the very same time, I hear often people say to me, well, we didn't vote for this, meaning the people who voted for Trump. We didn't vote for this. People who voted for Trump, I assume, not everyone, but I assume many of them thought he was going to provide a better life. They didn't expect that it would be a worse life. They didn't expect that he would be taking things away from them. I think a lot of people that didn't vote for him expected some of this level of chaos, as you've all said, and some of this level of undermining freedom for other people, not for themselves, but for other people. But so you hear a lot of this and expect this. And you're starting to hear, and I think you've all said this, a lot of, wait a second, this attack on universities, this is more than they say it is. This is a war on something that we actually really need. And you're starting to see that turn. You're starting to see, like in the Garcia case, that people are talking about, how do you take somebody away from this country without due process, without the rule of law? You may not like the person, you may not know the person, but the Supreme Court just 9-zip told you to facilitate a return. How do you do that? So you're starting, I think you're right, you're starting to see that turn. But for us, what I'm hearing you all say, and is that what we need to do as people who really believe in college, really believe in the promise of America and the promise of college education and university of education, the promise of freedom, the promise of peaceful dissent, the promise of our Constitution, the promise of critical thinking, the promise of innovation, the promise of research, the promise of all these things that actually happen on a college campus in hopefully a safe way that everyone is free from hate, that we actually have to fight this fight, both educate people about what's going on, rebuff the disinformation and misinformation, and actually bring community together, nurture it, communicate effectively, and fight this fight in not only the courts, but the court of public opinion. And when we fight that by educating people and by being on the streets and by actually taking some risk to actually make that fight, which is what, when people talk about a nationwide strike, that's what they're talking about. And I also heard the three of you say how committed you are to this task of making a more perfect union, of making the union movement, of our movement, actually being a foundation stone to education for all, to affordable college, to actually making sure that kids, regardless of who they are, where they are, that they can fly and they can thrive. So I just want to say thank you to the three of you. Thank you to Todd Wolfson, to Marcel Aguirres, to Katie Roger, because you represent, I know you're going to tell me that you're just like everybody else, but you represent the best of who we are as a union, who we are as educators, and who we are as believers in liberty, justice, and opportunity for all. Thank you very, very, very much. And for everybody who is listening, this is Union Talk, and this is our episode really explaining the war on higher education by Donald Trump and his administration and what we are doing to fight it. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Union Talk. Remember to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast and tune in every other week for a new episode. Thank you, be safe, and be well.